She was 19 years old. A teenage farm girl who couldn't read or write, who had just helped flip the entire 100 Years' War on its head. She'd marched armies, shattered sieges, and crowned a king. And now? She's chained to a block of wood in an English-controlled fortress, guarded by enemy soldiers who absolutely hate her. This isn't the Joan of Arc you see in paintings with a sword raised high. This is Joan at her lowest point, locked in a cell, shackled day and night, surrounded by men who want her broken, humiliated, and erased from history. The same woman who claimed to hear the voices of saints is now being interrogated by church officials determined to prove those voices came from demons instead. Every question is a trap. Every answer could be her death sentence. She's denied legal counsel. She's denied basic protections under church law. She's mocked, threatened, and left terrified for her life. And the one thing she refuses to give up, wearing men's clothing, might be the very thing that gets her burned alive. Because what happened to Joan in prison wasn't justice. It was a carefully staged execution disguised as a trial. And once you see what really went down behind those prison walls, you'll never look at her death the same way again. So now that you've seen how far Joan had fallen, here's how she ended up in that nightmare to begin with. Just months earlier, Joan of Arc was untouchable. She'd helped drive the English out of Orleans, marched across France like a force of nature, and stood beside Charles as he was crowned king. But on May 23, 1430, everything flipped. During a skirmish outside the town of Compiègne, Burgundian forces, French allies of the English, captured her. In that moment, they didn't just take a prisoner. They grabbed the most politically explosive figure in all of Europe. Joan was priceless. And the English knew it. By November, the English paid the Burgundians 10,000 francs for her, an insane sum at the time, basically the price of an army. This wasn't about punishment. It was about optics. If the English could prove Joan was a fraud, a heretic, a demon-led impostor, then everything she'd accomplished collapsed with her. And so would the legitimacy of King Charles himself. She was transported to Rouen, the administrative heart of English-occupied France, and locked inside the castle of Bouvrouil, controlled by the Earl of Warwick. From that point on, Joan wasn't treated like a religious suspect. She was treated like enemy property. Chained to a wooden block. Sometimes shackled at the feet. Guards watching her non-stop. No privacy. No safety. Just enemy soldiers and a growing sense that this was never going to be a fair fight. And that's when the English made their next move, turning the church into a weapon. Because what they planned to do to Joan in that courtroom was far worse than anything a battlefield could have thrown at her. So Joan is locked inside an English fortress, chained, watched, and completely at their mercy. And that's when the real trap snaps shut. On January 3, 1431, an official edict drops. Joan of Arc isn't being treated as a prisoner of war anymore. She's being charged with religious crimes. Her case is handed to an ecclesiastical court, which sounds holy and impartial, but don't be fooled. The man put in charge is Pierre Cauchon, the Bishop of Beauvais, a longtime political ally of the English occupation. This wasn't a neutral judge. This was a setup from the jump. The accusations were brutal and carefully chosen. Wearing men's clothing, which they claimed violated biblical law. Saying she received visions from God. Refusing to submit fully to church authority. Every single charge was designed to corner her into heresy, no matter how she answered. If Joan was a fraud, then her victories weren't divine, they were criminal. And that meant Charles's crown was built on a lie. Formal interrogations began on February 21, 1431. Joan was dragged into the castle chapel to face Cauchon and 42 clerics who had already made up their minds. She agreed to swear an oath to tell the truth, but with one hard line she refused to cross. She would not say anything that endangered King Charles. Over the next month, she endured nearly a dozen interrogation sessions. No lawyer. No advocate. Just a teenage girl facing a wall of trained theologians firing questions like weapons. They pressed her non-stop about her visions, her clothes, and her obedience. And then came the question meant to destroy her. They asked if she believed she was in a state of God's grace. Joan instantly saw the trap. Say yes, and she contradicted church doctrine. Say no, and she admitted her visions weren't divine. Most people would have frozen. Joan didn't. She calmly answered that if she wasn't in God's grace, she prayed He would place her there, and if she was, she prayed He would keep her there. Even her judges had nothing to say. And that's when something unexpected started happening inside that courtroom, something the English absolutely did not plan for. So after that answer, the room shifted. And everyone there felt it. Joan wasn't cracking. In fact, the deeper the interrogations went, the more obvious it became that she was outthinking men who'd spent their entire lives studying theology. Over time, the original 70 charges against her were quietly slashed down to just 12 articles of accusation. Not because the court was being merciful, but because so many of the original claims simply wouldn't stick. Joan defended herself with calm logic, sharp memory, and an almost unreal composure for someone her age. She corrected clerics on dates, challenged contradictions, and refused to be bullied into false confessions. And that's when cracks started forming inside the tribunal itself. A few members began to realize this wasn't a search for truth, it was a hunt. One tribunal member openly stepped down, stating that Joan's testimony was being twisted to entrap her rather than honestly examined. Another cleric went even further, questioning Bishop Cauchon's legal right to even preside over the trial. That man was immediately thrown in prison. Message received. But while Joan was holding her ground in the courtroom, her real suffering was happening back in her cell. Church law was crystal clear. Women accused of heresy were supposed to be held in church prisons, guarded by women, usually nuns. Joan got none of that. She was kept in a male military jail, under English control, guarded by common soldiers who saw her as the enemy who humiliated them on the battlefield. She was chained to a massive wooden block, sometimes shackled at the feet, even inside her cell. Guards stayed inside with her around the clock. According to later testimony, 3 soldiers were stationed inside her cell at all times, with 2 more just outside the door. No privacy. No safety. No escape. And it wasn't just intimidation. Witnesses later described constant harassment, verbal abuse, and threats. Joan lived in non-stop fear. When she became seriously ill with fever and thought she might die, she begged for the sacrament and a Christian burial. They refused. And what she was actually protecting herself from inside that cell was far worse than most people realize. So the danger Joan faced wasn't just psychological. It was terrifyingly physical. During the later rehabilitation trial in 1456, witnesses finally spoke openly about what had really happened inside that prison. Joan wasn't just harassed, she was threatened. One witness testified that a powerful English lord attempted to assault her while she was imprisoned. Suddenly, one of the most controversial details of her case makes brutal sense. Joan's men's clothing wasn't about rebellion. It was armor. The clothes were tightly laced, bound, and difficult to remove, unlike a woman's dress, which could be pulled away easily. Joan argued again and again that wearing men's clothing was necessary for her safety while locked in a cell with male guards. She said it was more proper to dress that way than to leave herself exposed and vulnerable. This wasn't defiance. It was survival. The judges dismissed her reasoning without hesitation. But the danger was real. And the setup against her went far beyond her clothes. The trial itself was packed with violations. Joan was interrogated for weeks before the formal charges were even read to her. She was denied legal counsel entirely. The trial was held in Rouen instead of her home diocese, which was a direct violation of canon law. And it gets worse. Evidence later showed that trial transcripts were altered. Statements were changed, trimmed, or rewritten to make Joan sound more incriminating than she actually was. The outcome was being manufactured in real time. The verdict wasn't being discovered, it was being built. By May of 1431, the English and their allies were done pretending. Theologians from the University of Paris reviewed the case and delivered their judgment. Joan's voices were declared demonic. Her clothing was labeled unnatural and wicked. Her refusal to submit fully to church authority branded her a heretic. She was given one final choice: recant or burn. And when they led her to the cemetery and placed her beside the stake, the reality of what that choice meant finally hit her all at once. So imagine this moment. After months of chains, illness, fear, and isolation, Joan is dragged out to the cemetery of Saint-Ouen and placed right next to a stake. No metaphors anymore. No legal language. Just wood, fire, and death staring her straight in the face. And it breaks her. She's exhausted. She's sick. She's 19 years old. The king she crowned has done nothing to save her. Faced with being burned alive right there, Joan agrees to sign an abjuration. She recants her visions. She admits, on paper, that she deceived the people of France. In exchange, her sentence is reduced to perpetual imprisonment instead of death. The relief is immediate but hollow. She's ordered to wear a woman's dress, and this time, she complies. For a few days, it looks like the trial is over. The English got what they wanted, a public confession that undermined everything Joan stood for. But that peace doesn't last. When Bishop Cauchon and the judges return to her cell shortly afterward, they find Joan wearing men's clothing again. Joan says she changed back willingly. She claims the voices of Saint Catherine and Saint Margaret condemned her for denying the truth to save her life. But years later, witnesses would tell a different story. They testified that during the night, guards deliberately stole Joan's dress and left her with nothing else to wear. No choice. No alternative. Put the men's clothing back on, or sit naked in a cell full of hostile soldiers. Either way, the result was exactly what the judges needed. Because under church law, a heretic who relapsed after recanting couldn't be forgiven again. There was no appeal. No delay. No mercy. And at that moment, Joan's fate was sealed. Because now, they finally had the excuse they were waiting for. So once Joan was labeled a relapsed heretic, everything moved fast. Too fast. On May 28, 1431, Bishop Cauchon and 7 other judges interrogated Joan inside her cell. No public hearing. No debate. She told them exactly why she was wearing men's clothing again, because she needed protection while imprisoned among men, and because her voices had reproached her for recanting. That was all they needed. The decision was basically automatic. Under canon law, relapse meant death. The judges unanimously agreed that Joan of Arc had to be handed over to secular authorities for execution. Burning alive. The next morning, May 30, 1431, something unexpected happened. Joan was allowed to receive the sacraments. Technically, this violated church law for a condemned heretic, but even her enemies couldn't fully strip her of that final dignity. It was the last mercy she would be shown. She was then led through the streets of Rouen to the old marketplace, the Place du Vieux Marché. A massive crowd had gathered. At the center stood a tall plastered pillar, already prepared. This should have been the moment when the church formally handed her over to secular officials. Instead, the English took direct control, making it clear who was really behind this execution. As she was tied to the pillar, Joan made one final request. She asked to see a cross. An English soldier, someone she'd been fighting against her entire life, was moved by her plea. He snapped 2 sticks together and fashioned a small cross, handing it to her. Joan kissed it and held it against her chest. Moments later, a large processional crucifix was brought from a nearby church. She embraced it before her hands were bound, and it was held up in front of her eyes. Then the flames were lit. And what happened in those final minutes is something every witness remembered for the rest of their lives. So as the fire caught, the reality of it hit everyone watching. The flames rose fast, wrapping around the wooden pillar as smoke filled the square. And above the crackling fire and the noise of the crowd, people could hear Joan's voice. She wasn't screaming in rage. She wasn't cursing her judges. She was praying. Witnesses later said she kept crying out the name of Jesus, again and again, louder as the flames climbed higher. That single word cut through the chaos of the marketplace. Even hardened soldiers were shaken. Some reportedly wept. Others turned away, unable to watch. Joan was 19 years old. When the fire finally consumed her, the executioners weren't done. Her body was burned again. And then again. The English wanted no doubt. No relics. No symbols. No chance that her remains could become objects of devotion. What was left of her ashes was thrown into the Seine River, erased as completely as possible. The English believed they had won. They thought they destroyed the girl, the myth, and the threat she represented. But in trying to erase Joan of Arc, they accidentally guaranteed she would never be forgotten. Because her death didn't end the story. 25 years later, at the request of Joan's mother, a rehabilitation trial was convened. 115 witnesses testified: soldiers, townspeople, clergy, people who had known Joan personally or witnessed her trial. The court tore apart the 1431 verdict piece by piece. They declared it invalid, biased, corrupt, riddled with procedural violations. In 1920, the Catholic Church canonized her as Saint Joan of Arc. The woman burned as a heretic became a patron saint of France. A symbol of courage, faith, and injustice. So here's the real question. If you'd been standing in that marketplace on May 30th, 1431, watching a teenage girl call out to God as she burned, would you have recognized it for what it truly was? Not justice, but judicial murder dressed up as holy authority.